Hi, my name's Kelly and we are out in my garden today to do a little spring tour. I've gotten a lot of questions about my garden and if I'm gardening this year because I've not been doing as many YouTube videos, so I thought I would do a little update. Another fun thing is that Tim and I are going for a road trip for 2 weeks, so I thought it would be cool to kind of document what the garden looks like now and then do another tour when we get back just to show like how fast things grow in the spring. So right at the entrance of our garden we have our sugar snap peas. We kind of always do them along the fence line here just because they need a trellis and you know the fence is already set up, so why not? And then next, this is a sage plant that overwintered and is growing back like a bush. It's so healthy and luscious. So this row with the bush of sage, I've kind of just turned into my herb and extra garden plants row because this side of the garden gets pretty shaded in the afternoon and herbs tend to take to partial sun better than vegetables. Most, if not all, vegetables want full sun. So I have some, actually a lot of chamomile, extra sunflowers, more chamomile. It's a rosemary plant. This is the sage that I planted this year as a comparison to the one that overwintered. And I like to plant marigolds just kind of everywhere. I almost forgot to bring attention to this massive catnip plant. I actually just trimmed all the tops off to dry catnip for my cats, but this is like a weed. It comes up all over in the garden and I just usually leave this one. So we'll just kind of go through row by row. So this next row, this will be the second year I'm trying this. I am growing the mammoth sunflowers. They're the kind that get like 15 feet tall and like flower heads the size of basketballs. And then these are different kind of pole beans that will climb the stalks. So the sunflowers are like a natural trellis for these pole beans. So today is Memorial Day, or is it May 31st? And we'll get back from our vacation around like June 20th. Yeah. So actually the two videos will be like 3 weeks apart. Okay, so for reference, the sunflower is not up to my knee yet, and the beans just sprouted less than a week ago. So in this next row we have my tomatoes. So there is some volunteer sunflowers. There was a lot more, but I decided to just leave 2, kind of staggered, because there was a lot of them that would have shaded these tomatoes out. So I left 2 that would be kind of out of the way. And I wonder even if they would work well as a trellis for this. This is a cherry tomato, and last year they got so tall that they grew up to here and then kept growing and flopped over and reached all the way to the ground. So I trellis my tomatoes with T-posts and plastic twine. I grew up with my parents' garden. They always use tomato cages, which is simple, easy, you can reuse them each year. But from working on a few organic vegetable farms, I learned that like this is how they would trellis their tomatoes, and I learned that a lot of tomato diseases are caused by moisture, so airflow is really important for tomatoes. So this way of trellising allows you to prune and trellis as the plant grows to allow for more airflow, so everything stays more dry and less likely to contract the different diseases that can affect the fruit of the plant or the longevity of the plant. So the plastic twine just goes on either side of the tomato plant, wraps around these really, and you have to make sure they're really tight, otherwise they sag over time. And then I've pruned all the leaves up until the first flower cluster. You don't want tomato leaves touching the ground because that's where a lot of the diseases and stuff come from that can affect tomato plants, is from the soil or moisture droplets. And some YouTubers use cattle panels as a permanent trellis that they just kind of tie their tomato plants to. They use a cattle panel and the T-posts, and I would love to do that, but the house that we're living in now is a house that we rent, and these cattle panels are really big and we don't really want to store them here or have to move them to wherever we live next. So this year I'm trying something new by growing lettuce in between a lot of my tomato plants. My thought is that when these tomato plants are small, there's a lot of open ground in between each one, like 3 feet. And lettuce grows fast. Like I just seeded this. I literally seeded this last week and it's already sprouted and growing. So by the time the lettuce or the tomato plants get big enough to really take over this space, the lettuce, we probably will have harvested off the lettuce a few times at that point. And also lettuce likes cooler weather. So even when it does start to get shaded out, by that time it should be like the middle of summer when it doesn't probably want that direct sunlight and heat anyway. But I've actually never done that, so well, I guess we'll just see how that works out. Then at the end of my tomato row, I have some spinach. The back of my garden also gets shade sooner in the afternoon than the rest of the garden too, so I ended up putting a lot of my greens and cool weather, things that prefer it to be cooler, towards the back of the garden. Speaking of garden planning and like where to put things, south is that direction for me generally. So the sun is coming like at my face right now. So if the sun is shining this way, I'm putting all the tallest things back here, like these giant sunflowers. Tomatoes get really tall, and then progressively shorter things so that things aren't shading each other out. It sounds pretty simple to plan that way until you start to try and factor in crop rotation, and you only have a small space, so that's been kind of tricky for me. Like the tomatoes are kind of in the same place. Yeah, try to move things around best I can, but just with the limited space I have and the way the sunlight moves, there's limited options. So at the end of this next row, we have some more greens. This is Mizuna, an Asian green, arugula, the purple is a mustard green, and then radishes. So the rest of that row is peppers and flowers. I like to plant flowers like in between everything to fill space and make everything more beautiful and attract pollinators, mostly just because it looks pretty and fun. But I'm about to show you an example of why it's important to have healthy seedlings, and maybe as the season goes on, maybe it'll be less obvious, but right now I have some peppers that are from monarchs that were very root bound, which is when their roots just keep circling because they've been in their container too long. And I have peppers from my friend who does an organic vegetable farm, who is really good at growing her growing her vegetables and plants, and starts them in really high quality compost, and it just makes the biggest difference. Here is my little jalapeno plants from Menards, brown spots, and they've not really grown since I've planted them. About as tall as my hand is a nasturtium, and this is orange cosmos. So the benefit is that these were really cheap. I got 6 jalapeno plants for less than $2, but they have all these brown spots. They seem stunted. They're not really growing. We did have a few nights with near freezing temperatures, and peppers do not tolerate that well. So that could be part of the reason they're stunted. But these other pepper plants I'm about to show you are humongous and they're thriving. So here is a jalapeno plant from my friend Kristen at Blue Moon Farm. It is much bigger. That's Menards, that's Kristen's. And then these are sweet peppers from Kristen, more cosmos. I think these are the pink ones. So I guess time will tell if those little stunted jalapeno plants will catch up to the rest, or if they will have been a waste of garden space. So next, after the peppers, we have basil. Basil also does not like cold temperatures, and it'll get these dark spots on its leaves if it gets below 40 degrees. So that happened a few times this last week, but the damage isn't so bad. It'll recover just fine. So next in this row is ground cherries, which they look pretty rough. There's been some bugs eating them, but I'm not gonna do anything because I really think, based on past years where I've grown ground cherries, it kind of does just start out like this, but they start growing, once they get established, they start growing so fast that they will recover just fine. Then at the end of this ground cherry row is my green beans. So these are a bush bean, not like the ones by the sunflowers that will climb. These are bush, like your typical bush bean, and I'm growing both because the pole beans tend to take a lot longer before you get green beans, whereas the bush beans, they'll be ready to eat sooner. In the pole beans, I have different kinds that you can eat as green beans, or you can let them dry and save the beans, and they have like one is like a black bean and the other one has this cool heirloom one. I think it's called the turkey craw because it was found in the Americas inside a turkey's crop or something, so I thought that was cool. So if we got plenty of green beans from the bush beans, we can save those pole beans for dry beans. So that's why I'm doing both. So we're at another end of a row where I have seeded some kale and cabbage just directly sown into the ground. I bought some plants that someone else started who knows more what they're doing, and then I'm giving my hand at trying to start some direct sown just right into the garden. So I believe this is a purple kale, not cabbage. Then I have some red Russian kale, which is one that you more eat as a baby green, or you can. So that's sowed differently, more in a row like the arugula lettuces. I believe this is my green cabbage. I'll probably thin these down to 1 right before I leave for vacation. I just want to see what one ends up being strongest before I do that. So then in more of the front of that row, we have the kale plants and some cabbage plants that I actually bought, also from my friend Kristen. And these I'm sure we'll be able to harvest from as soon as we get back from vacation because they are growing really fast. And look at this one. Marigolds everywhere. Here's the cabbage. I love how marigolds look with purple cabbage or purple kale. Just wait to see how it looks when they all fill out. So In the front of these next 3 rows is a little patch of, actually a big patch of milkweed, which is a native flower that monarch butterflies feed on. It's one of their only foods. So I allow it to grow in this footprint. It wants to take over the whole garden, but it gets really tall, like maybe this tall, and kind of takes over. So I let it have this space. Last year we found a few caterpillars and raised them into butterflies and released them in here. So that was pretty cool. So I want to leave the food for the monarch butterflies. So it gets a pretty generous space in my garden. It looks like it's getting buds already. I bet these will be blooming or near blooming when we get back. And they smell amazing. So right behind me over my shoulder here is my potatoes. I have a whole video from last season on how I grow potatoes in clay soil. Wow. Because it can be a real bugger to dig them out of hard clay. I didn't have compost ready this year, so instead this year I used peat moss and old chicken bedding. The bedding is not composted, but I think the manure is old and dry enough that it's not going to burn the plants. And look how nice it looks. It's so sunny that I'm just taking a guess that you can see what I'm referring to, but this next row, right next to the potatoes and over my shoulder again, is a bunch of red cabbage and marigolds and borage. They're different flowers that I planted in between, and I really want to make purple sauerkraut this year. Last year my cabbages all got eaten by the little caterpillars, except for my purple ones, because I think you can just see the green caterpillars easier on purple cabbage, so you can pick them off by hand easier before things get crazy. So I'm mostly doing purple cabbage this year, and I've done purple sauerkraut before and it's so good. I don't know if it's because it's purple that it tastes better or if it's just more fun to eat because it's purple, but this is something I'm really looking forward to. Look at this enormous borage plant. It's gonna bloom really soon. So we're getting towards the end of the garden. This next row is kind of a quick temporary row, and I'll explain why real soon. First we have more greens, lettuce, arugula, radishes, and spinach. These I planted really early and they should be eaten now because they're already shooting up seed heads because it's already getting too hot for them. The spinach looks amazing. So then at the end of this row with the greens is onions. This row I'm calling temporary because these are things I want to grow and harvest quickly, because next in the garden is squash, and when they get going they kind of really take over, taking up a lot of space. But I didn't want this space to go to waste, so I'm gonna get some greens and onions out of it, and by the time, this is the plan, by the time that the squash vines reach over here, these greens will be done and we'll be ready to pull these onions, hopefully. So I'm trying something different with my cucumbers this year. I put this tomato cage over them, and then I'm going to use these plastic clips to, if they need them, to kind of train them to climb this. And that is to help so that just to leave more space for walking around over here so they're not kind of sprawling everywhere. And similar to the tomato plants, If you can get the vines and the fruit off the ground and more airflow, there's less likely to be disease. But I've never done it this way before, so it's an experiment. Another thing I'm trying new this year is growing my squash in mounds instead of rows. And that's always what the seed packet recommends, is to do a mound and plant 4 to 6 seeds in each mound and leave a 6-foot radius around each mound to kind of let the squash sprawl out in a circle. And I don't know why I've always not done it that way. I think because I grew up with planting everything in rows, and actually that's how the farms that I worked at did it too, is planting things in rows. But this year I set out my squash plants in rows and they were doing terribly. They were yellow, stunted, they were flowering way too early, and I think it was because the ground was too wet. Even though we've had a dry spring, this clay soil retains moisture like crazy, and their roots were too wet. So I think part of the reason the mounds are a good idea for squash is so their roots don't drown and get too wet. So that's pretty much what I had to do this year because all my squash plants were dying in this too wet soil. So I just got some compost, bagged compost from Menards, and made these little hills, planted some seeds in it. They're not sprouted yet because I just did this a few days ago, but I think they look cute already. Don't mind the weeds. So that's pretty much my garden so far this spring. Oh, I almost forgot. Well, besides there being a bunch of volunteer sunflowers and borage over in the squash area that I'm just gonna leave because they'll be fine growing in amongst the squash vines, we kind of added to our little perennial corner. We have had purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans over here. My husband Tim had just found them on the curb 2 years ago that somebody was just getting rid of, so we planted them, and then we just got some more perennial flowers to add. And I also filled it in with some annuals, like more cosmos. So that's a purple coneflower. This is Blazing Star. Monarchs love these like crazy. Love them, love them. Even more than milkweed. They get these stalks of purple flowers, and they had these planted on campus where I went to college, and there would literally be like 5 to 6 monarchs on each stalk at all times when they were blooming. So I'm really looking forward to that. I don't remember what that is. It looks kind of like oregano, but it's not. This is lemon verbena. Makes me think of Little House on the Prairie because that was the perfume that what's her name? The teacher, Miss Beadle on Little House on the Prairie, and Laura loved that smell. Anyway, it smells amazing, and look at these cute little flowers. I planted a bunch of these pink cosmos in this corner. They get really tall and kind of need support, so I thought a corner would be best, but they get these papery, like tissue papery pink flowers, and they're so whimsical and cute. Here's our rhubarb that never does anything. It never gets bigger than this, so I put a bunch of compost around it. Maybe it needs more fertilizer, but it only ever gets this big, and like there's hardly any stalks. So, but whatever, you do you, rhubarb. And then this is Joe Pie weed. This is Tim's grandma's favorite flower. And then that, oh gosh, that is Black-Eyed Susan and another purple coneflower. We have another Black-Eyed Susan over here, and we're really excited to see how this little perennial corner works out. And I honestly, like, even though like we don't own this property, we rent here, I think it's kind of cool to have this little perennial corner. It's like leaving a little legacy behind when we move. Like, we can always just buy more plants once we have our own place, but we want to enjoy them now too, so I don't even feel bad. Like, they'll either get mowed over or someone else will get to enjoy them year after we leave. And I almost forgot, on this fence edge, they kind of get lost in the weeds. I have sunflowers lining the fence line, and they're these like red and orange. I think they're called evening sunflowers, so that'll be really pretty. So there you go, that's my spring garden as of May 31st. For those of you who have been kindly asking about my garden, I love sharing my garden. Like I wish you could all come and walk through it with me, but this is the next best thing. So I hope you enjoyed the tour, and we'll see you guys again in a few weeks to see how much everything's changed after we get back from our road trip. And if you're curious, we're going to Olympic National Park.